Hello and welcome to River Reflections. We are a broadcast ministry outreach of River of Life Ministries. If you just saw the last 30 seconds, you saw shots from our church, River of Life. Some of us dancing around and some of us eating brunch. And we would love to have you come visit our church. If you like the things you hear on this show, come to our church and you can see the rest of our people and hear it live. River of Life Ministries address is 3412 Leonard Street Northwest. It's about 4 miles west of 131 from Leonard. It's in Walker, just a little bit past Remembrance Road. There's our address right there on the screen for you to read, 3412 Leonard. We'll leave it up there a second if you needed to write it down so you can come visit. Our service times are on Wednesday evenings starting at 6:30. With prayer, and then we have teaching and praise. And if you want to come on Saturdays, we start at 9:30 with a service. Then we have a little bit of break for brunch from approximately 10:30 to 11. That time's a little flexible if the first service goes a little long. And then we all come back together again. So that gives us the time to fellowship, get to know one another. River of Life Ministries is not particularly large mega church, so if you walk in, most people are going to know you're a visitor. It's not the type of church where you're going to be able to sit in the back and be unnoticed. Now, we'll probably let you sit in the back quietly, but you'll be noticed and people will come up and say hello, and we hope that's the type of atmosphere that you're looking for. I do want to make a quick note about masks. A lot of people are wearing masks nowadays, and it's required in certain public places. At River of Life Ministries, we do not make masks a requirement to come visit our service. But if you're comfortable wearing a mask, please feel free to do so. Nobody's going to be shamed one way or the other. We decided that those that want to wear a mask will wear a mask, and those that don't will not, and we don't believe in telling anybody that their choice in that regard is wrong. There's enough other things that people disagree on. That's not one we're going to have a discussion about. So if that's the type of atmosphere, again, that you'd like, please come visit anytime. Well, not anytime, but the times I mentioned earlier. This show, River Reflections, usually one of our pastors, Robert and Rosemary Barnes, is teaching. But they are out of town at the moment, and so they have tapped me, their deacon, to come and fill in for them. I've done this a few times, and last time I was on the show, I had the opportunity, I spoke a message about God changing us from being a worrier to a warrior. And when I did that, I spent a lot of time on the details of the story of Gideon, and didn't get to some of the other things that I was hoping to get to. So I'm going to take this opportunity to review what I talked about last week, go through it a little bit quicker, and then add and expand on what I had talked about earlier. So that's what I'm going to do today. But first, let's review the story of Gideon. You're going to find that in Judges 6 and I believe chapter 7. So I'm going to go through that, starting with some background on Gideon. The Midianites were basically oppressing the people of Israel, and they were living in caves because the Midianites would come, they'd steal their food, they'd try to hide what food they have, and Gideon was there in his cave, and he was like threshing wheat, basically trying to deal with the food that he had and store it away in a place where the Midianites wouldn't steal it. And the angel of the Lord came to Gideon. And the first thing he said to Gideon is, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And he called Gideon a mighty warrior, which seemed kind of odd for this guy who was hiding in his cave, trying to hide his food from the enemies. And so Gideon asked the angel, "If you're from the Lord, why is this happening to us?" And the angel talked about some of the things about them worshiping other gods and turning to idols. But the angel said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand." And Gideon's like, "Well, my family's like from the smallest tribe, and I'm like the least in my family. So he made excuses about how little he was, how much he wasn't in comparison to others. But the angel of the Lord said, I will be with you, and you will strike down the Midianites. So Gideon went up, but at first he had to address the idolatry, the idol worship that was going on. And even in his own father's household, there was, what was it, an Asherah pole or something that was not to God. It was to one of the false gods. And he went and he tore that down. But being Gideon and being still somewhat afraid, he went at night so that nobody could see that it was him. He was still fearful. He was doing what he knew was right from God to take down that idol, but he was still doing that in a fearful manner. But eventually it was found out, and they complained to his dad and said, well, if Baal is the idol to Baal, and it's like, if Baal has a problem with that, let Baal contend for himself. And so I don't want to say Gideon got away with that, but Gideon was proven right in what he was doing, that he was right to tear down that idol, and God was stronger than Baal, so Baal, did not have any power against Gideon in that regard. So, again, Gideon was going to go out, but he was fearful. He's like, okay, God, I want to know it's really you, and so I'm going to put this fleece out, and if in the morning the fleece is wet and the ground around it is dry, then I'll know it's you. And the next morning, that's exactly how it was. And all of a sudden, Gideon's like, well, maybe it always does that. So he says to God, God, one more time, I want to do the same thing, only vice versa. Flip it around so that the fleece is dry, ground is wet. And God wasn't angry with Gideon because, again, he understood that Gideon was flesh and that Gideon was weak, but he wanted Gideon to be mighty, to act mighty. So he gave Gideon the sign that he needed. So Gideon went out. He knew he was going to fight Midian, so he got like all the men he could. He goes out. God says, nope, you got too many men. Got to wean them out. So he says, ask the guys if anybody wants to go home. If you want to stay here and fight, or if you're afraid, you can go home. It's like, okay, I'll tell them. So he told them, and a lot of the guys went home because Midian was a strong, powerful army. It was more than what even he had assembled thus far. So Gideon's like, okay, they went home. Now we got the guys that are ready to fight. And God looks down again. It's like, no, you got too many. If you do it with too many men, you're still going to boast in your own strength. I'm going to make sure you know that it's me, that it's God that's fighting for you. So he's like, take them to the river and separate the ones who dunk their heads in the river to drink and the ones who cup up the water with their hands and lap it up that way. And so after the weaning, the thinning, he was down to 300 men. So then Gideon took his 300 men against the thousands of Midianite army. And God said to him, if you're still afraid, I want you to take somebody with you, go down to the Midianite camp, listen to what they were saying. And he went down to the camp, and he heard the Midianites, one of them talking about this dream of what was happening and the destruction coming to the camp. And they said, this can only be the hand of the Lord, the God of Israel. And so Gideon knew at that point that God was going to bring the army into their hands. And sure enough, he got his 300 men. He put torches into pitchers. They broke their pitchers. They blew their trumpets. And the men of Midian started turning on themselves and basically killing themselves. And Gideon, all he had to do was stand. Gideon didn't have to lift up a sword himself. He didn't have to cut off the head of any Midianites at that point. They just stood where they were with their trumpets, declaring for the Lord and for Gideon. That's what they were doing down. And so God turned Gideon. Gideon had a reputation at that point of being a mighty warrior. He was that same man. He was that same flesh. But he became a warrior, not because of anything he had done in his own strength, but because he listened to God and he stood and he let God do the work. He let God do that fight for him. Next story, and I think I got on some of this last time I taught too, was about Moses. So I want you to turn to Exodus 3, And 4, chapters 3 and 4 is where, if you want to read more than what I'm going to tell you here, you'll see the story of Moses. But before Exodus 3, there's a story about when Moses was still living in Egypt amongst the pharaohs, but he was known to be an Israelite. He saw one of Pharaoh's people abusing the Israelites who were slaves at that time. And he got angry with them, and he came against that Egyptian. He actually killed him. But then he was worried that he'd get found out, so he buried the body and thought, okay, nobody will know about this. But then later on, he saw a couple of his own countrymen arguing, and he tried to break it up. And they're like, what, you're going to kill us like you did the Egyptian? So then he knew this thing was found out. And Moses was just so scared at that point of okay, what's going to happen? Because now they know I did this thing. He fled Egypt. He ran away and basically lived somewhere else for years. He was all done dealing with Egypt, being with his people, and he went and lived in another land with some other people. So while he's there, he's tending the flock of sheep of his father-in-law, because he had found a wife when he was out, and then he saw this bush that was burning but wasn't burning up. And so he's like, okay, I got to come see what's going on. And then the Lord spoke to him out of the bush. And he said, go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And the first words out of Moses' mouth to that were, who am I? He didn't recognize himself as somebody who was going to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. He was like, I'm the guy that ran away from Egypt. I'm not the guy that's going to, go in there, with the armies and the blaring and say to do this. But God said, I will be with you. That was pretty much what God had to say. But he said, this will be a sign when you bring the people out, you're going to worship on this mountain. And Moses had a few other questions for God, like, what will I say your name is? What if they don't believe me? And he showed him the sign with the staff and the snake. And then Moses still was making excuses. He's like, you know what? I've never been eloquent in speech before, or even since you have spoken to me, I'm still slow of speech, slow of tongue. And God said, who gave people their mouths? Now go, I will speak and teach you what to say. And Moses still said, no, send someone else. And God finally allowed Moses' brother Aaron to come in and speak for him. Well, the rest of the story is Moses came, the plagues got sent, Pharaoh let the people go. Moses was known as the person who went down to Egypt, freed the slaves, let the people go. Because Moses was so great? No, but because he listened to God and he went and he did what God told him to do with the staff. God sent the frogs. God sent the locusts. God was the one that dealt with Pharaoh's heart. Moses just had to go and be obedient, and God did the work, but Moses was known then as a mighty warrior. And one more story I'm going to quickly, or not, read is about in the book of Daniel, chapter 3, verse 14 through 28. Some backstory on this. This is when the people of Israel were captive in Babylon, and there were 3 young Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the king at that time, Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler, had built this idol. And he was just so proud of this idol and this thing. He wanted everybody to bow down to this. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were like, they knew their allegiance had to be to God and not to Nebuchadnezzar. And even though they were in that foreign land, they knew who their God was, and they weren't going to disobey. They weren't going to disobey the commandment about no other gods before him. So they wouldn't bow down. So Daniel 3, starting with verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar brought them in and says, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you do not serve my gods, nor worship the golden statue I've set up? So now, if you're ready, I'll give you another chance. I'm going to blow the horn, the flute, the song. That was the cue for everybody to bow down. And when I blow these instruments, You can fall down and worship the statue I've made, and then we can just forget the whole thing ever happened. But if you don't worship, you will immediately be thrown into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can rescue you from my hands?" And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, "Well, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to answer you concerning this matter. But our God, whom we serve, is able to rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire. He'll rescue us from your hand, O king, and even if he does not, let it be known that we are not going to serve your gods, nor worship the golden statue that you set up." This made Nebuchadnezzar furious. He had the fire stoked 7 times hotter than usual. He had them thrown in it, and that fire was so hot that the men, he had them bound, and he had the men put them in there. And the men who had to put them in there got close enough to the fire that they perished. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were found safe in the fire. And when Nebuchadnezzar looked, he said, "Wait, wasn't it 3 men that we put in there?" And he's like, "I see 4 men walking around in the middle of the fire unharmed, and the appearance of the 4th is like the son of the gods." So Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could without getting burned up near the door of the furnace and shouted for the men to come out. And so he did, and they came out, and they were unbound. They didn't smell like smoke. Their clothes hadn't burned. The only thing that burned was the cords that had bound them. So to Shadrach, and Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't have a plan at that beforehand to escape the king. They didn't have some like witty way of escape or some thing that they were going to stand and fight the king. They just said, "No, we're not going to do this thing." And God came in, and he basically came through for them. And they weren't even sure. They knew that God could. They didn't even say at that point whether he would, but their faith was unshaken in that matter, and God came through for them. He fought on their behalf. So those are just a few examples in the Bible of where people were human. They didn't have to do any fighting, but God stepped up. He fought on their behalf. What gave me the idea to first teach this about going from a worrier to a warrior was actually a song on the radio that starts out with the line, "I'm not a warrior, I'm too afraid to lose." And when I first heard that line, "I'm not a warrior," the way my brain likes to play with words, I thought, I'm not a warrior. And I thought, oh, that could work as a kind of a subject, from worrier to warrior. But the song goes on to that, "I'm not a warrior, too afraid to lose. I feel unqualified for what you're calling me to. But Lord, with your strength, I've got no excuse, because broken people are exactly who you'll use." Now, I want to break away from the song for a second. It's not a requirement to be a broken person to be used of God. God can use anybody. But if you feel like you're broken, if you're weak, if you're unqualified, that makes no difference in God's eyes as to whether he's going to use you or not. He'll take you where you are. You just need to be obedient to God, and for the most part, just stand for him. Stand for what you believe in. And the chorus of the song says, "Give me faith like Daniel in the lion's den. Give me hope like Moses in the wilderness. Give me a heart like David. Lord, be my defense so I can face my giants with confidence." And I didn't read that story of David, but you'll find that, I think, I don't know if I've got this verse reference too, for in Samuel, where David was facing Goliath, and most of the men there were afraid of Goliath because he was a mighty warrior. David looked at him, and even though he was like a young shepherd boy, he saw him as an uncircumcised Philistine who came against the God of Israel. And David's faith was right there. It's like, well, this won't stand. This isn't going to be anything that we need to worry about, because God's surely going to give us this victory over this uncircumcised Philistine that mocks God to his face. And David basically said to Goliath, you come at me with swords and spears, but I'm coming at you in the name of the Lord, and God's going to give the battle to me this day. David had that faith that God was going to come through on his behalf. So that's the faith we're talking about. Like a heart like David, be my defense so I can face my giants with confidence. And so that's what gave me the idea of changing us from warrior to warrior. So I know we're not, God doesn't call everybody to be Moses or like a David, but he can call you where you are for whatever battle you have to face. Or he can even call you to be the person to pray with your boss or to talk to your neighbor. And you might feel unqualified. You might feel broken. You say, God, there's so many people that are better Christians than me that can do this thing, whatever this thing is, that maybe God is nudging you to do. God doesn't have to send an angel to put it in your heart what he feels you need to do in your life. And I'm going to go through several verses that talk about God being on our side as soon as I can find them in my notes. Because I do have my copy, so it's here. Okay. I believe I do. I believe I have my notes. Sorry for the singing. There we are. Okay. These are mostly verses from God to Israel, sometimes when they were in the wilderness, and sometimes they're words from the prophets. And I'm just going to start from the top of this list I have with Exodus 14, verse 14. It says, "The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." Now, I didn't look at the context of this verse in Exodus 14, so I think this is about the time that they were escaping out of Egypt, or maybe it was after. I know when they went through the Red Sea, the sea opened up for them, and the sea closed up on the Egyptians. They didn't have to fight the Egyptians. But God said, the Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 17. This was during the time of the kings. You will not need to fight in this battle. Stand firm, hold your position, and see the salvation of the Lord on your behalf. O Judah and Jerusalem, do not be afraid, do not be dismayed. Tomorrow go out against them, and the Lord will be with you. So he said, you don't even need to fight in the battle. Just hold your position. The Lord will be with you. Deuteronomy 20, verse 4. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you the victory. Another one in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 22. You shall not fear them, for it is the Lord your God who fights for you. There's just verse after verse when he was with Israel of like, I'm doing the fighting for you. You don't have to fear. You don't have to be afraid. I'm God. I've got this in control. Isaiah 40, verse 31. They that wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. So if you feel like you don't have the strength to do what it is you ought to do, what God's calling you to do, wait on the Lord. Spend some time in prayer. Spend some time reading his word. Spend some time getting to know him. And what will God do for you if you wait on the Lord? He'll renew your strength. He'll cause you to mount up with wings like eagles. Eagles are so majestic, and they're just up there and they soar. That's what we can be in God if we just wait on him. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Isaiah 54, verse 17 says, no weapon that is fashioned against you shall succeed, and you shall confute every tongue that rises against you in judgment. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their vindication from me, declares the Lord. So if you're serving the Lord, you will be vindicated. Those weapons that are formed against you are not going to prosper. They'll be the ones that are confused. They'll be the ones that won't know what's happening. And you'll know because you'll see what God can do in your life. Psalm 34, verse 17 says, when the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. Romans 8, verse 37, is that right? Yes. It says, in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. And those things that talked about in Romans before is talking about persecution, famine, war. In those things, we are going to be more than conquerors through them that loves us. And also in Romans 8, it says, what shall we say then to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? That's something to think about, because we always think about the things that are against us. Either it's how they feel about us, how we might be unable to speak, how we look. But if God is for us, who can be against us? And it's a rhetorical question. The answer is nobody. Nobody can be against us if God is for us. And finally, Isaiah 41 verse 10 says, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. So there's even, I dare say, 100 more verses that I could have read about how God fights for us. God stands up for us. God does these things for us if we turn on him. And most of the time, we don't have to do anything but stand, but declare the word of the Lord, like Gideon did, like Moses did, like the 3 Hebrew children did. God will come through for us. So if you're a worrier, don't worry about it. God will still use you. If you're broken, wait on God. God can restore. He can heal the broken parts of you, and he can definitely use you to be mighty in his strength. So in the last 30 seconds I have, I'd like to say a brief prayer. Lord, I thank you that you listen to us, that you hear us when we cry out to you, and that you come through on our behalf, that you use us not because of our weakness, but in spite of our weakness, and that you can show yourself strong even when we are weak. We thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for listening.